Jonathan Reed stood at the center of his mine office, lamplight catching the edges of surveyor maps spread across the oak table. Outside. Late February wind rattled the windows, throwing snow against the glass in sharp bursts. His three senior engineers huddled around the eastern shaft blueprints, their breath visible in the lamplight despite the potbelly stove crackling in the corner. Tremors are minor, his lead engineer Davis said, tracing a finger along the shaft's depth markers. Odd, but they're coming more frequent. Jonathan nodded, studying the expansion plans they'd been reviewing for weeks. The Reed mine employed half the territory, pulled silver from mountains his father had first claimed 30 years ago. Every decision carried weight beyond profit. Families depended on this operation. A whole town built around the rhythm of shift whistles and ore carts. A knock interrupted his response. Davis opened the door to reveal Sarah Mitchell, widow of Thomas Mitchell, who'd been Jonathan's chief engineer until illness took him 2 winters back. Snow dusted her practical wool coat, melting on her shoulders. She carried rolled diagrams under one arm, held them like they contained something precious. Mrs. Mitchell, Jonathan said, surprised. What brings you out in this weather? These. She moved to the table without invitation, unfurled engineering diagrams across his expansion plans. Lamplight revealed precise calculations, detailed shoring designs for the eastern shaft. I've been reviewing Thomas's geological surveys. The tremors you're experiencing indicate structural weakness here and here. Her gloved finger pointed to exact locations. This reinforcement pattern would stabilize the shaft and allow continued operation. Jonathan barely glanced at the diagrams. His engineers shifted uncomfortably. Recognizing Thomas's methodology and the precise line work, I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Mitchell, Jonathan said, his tone gentle but dismissive. But mining is men's work. Women are too delicate for this kind of engineering. Sarah's jaw tightened, though her voice remained steady. My husband believed competence had no gender. Mr. Reed, he taught me everything he knew about these mountains, this mine specifically. These calculations account for. I'm sure Thomas was thorough in his documentation. Jonathan interrupted. But I need experienced engineers making decisions about mine safety. This is dangerous work. Not suitable for a woman. Sarah finished quietly. She began rolling up her diagrams, movements precise despite obvious frustration. Thomas used to say pride makes poor foundation when you're building underground. Perhaps you'll reconsider. She left the plans on the side table anyway. A rolled cylinder of refused wisdom. The door closed behind her, wind-gusting snowflakes across the threshold before Davis pushed it shut. Jonathan returned to his engineers, trying to recapture the thread of their earlier discussion, but his eyes kept drifting to those rolled diagrams, untouched in the lamplight. Outside, the storm intensified, and somewhere deep in the mountain, the earth shifted again 5 days later. The morning shift emerged early from the eastern shaft, their faces pale in the gray dawn. Jonathan met them at the entrance, Davis already climbing out with rock dust coating his shoulders. Cave in, Davis reported, breathing hard. Minor, no injuries, but it revealed something we didn't see in the surveys. The support structure on the lower level is compromised. Whole section needs immediate attention. Also by noon, Jonathan's 3 senior engineers stood in the shaft with lanterns, examining the damage. Jonathan descended with them, seeing firsthand how rock had shifted, how wooden supports showed stress fractures they'd missed. The air smelled of disturbed earth and fear. They gathered in his office as afternoon shadows lengthened. Davis spread new calculations across the table. Full closure and rebuild, he said flatly. We seal the eastern shaft. Bring in timber from Denver. Reconstruct from the bottom up. 3 months minimum. Cost runs about $15,000. Jonathan felt the number like a physical blow. 3 months without the eastern shaft's production would devastate cash flow. $15,000 would require loans, maybe selling equipment. Footsteps on the stairs made them all turn. Sarah Mitchell appeared in the doorway, snow melting on her coat again. Word traveled fast in mining town. She'd heard about the cave-in. Bestavrebesteikerdi. Mr. Reed, she said, I know you dismissed my plans before, but I've recalculated based on what I'm hearing about the damage. Strategic reinforcement could stabilize the shaft in 2 weeks at roughly 5,000. Thomas surveyed that entire lower section 3 years ago. I have his notes. His recommendations for exactly this kind of situation. Abwim. Jonathan felt his engineers watching, felt the weight of decision pressing down. But his father's voice echoed in memory. Women are to be protected from harsh realities. Son, not dragged into them. I appreciate your continued concern, Mrs. Mitchell, he said, keeping his voice level. But this is beyond. He caught himself before saying it. But the words hung unspoken anyway. Beyond a woman's understanding. Sarah's eyes flashed. Beyond what? Mr. Reed, beyond my late husband's expertise, which he spent 2 years teaching me, beyond the geological surveys he conducted specifically anticipating this kind of structural issue. I need experienced engineers, Jonathan said, the words coming out harder than intended. People who've worked mines, who understand the dangers. You mean men, Sarah said quietly. The silence stretched uncomfortable. His engineers studied the floor. Jonathan felt cornered, which made him defensive. I mean professionals with proven track records. Sarah's expression shifted from frustration to something sadder, more knowing. Pride's a heavy burden when the ground beneath you is crumbling, Mr. Reed. She left without argument this time. Didn't even offer her plans again. Jonathan watched through the window as she walked down the muddy street toward her modest house on the edge of town. Davis cleared his throat. Sir. Thomas Mitchell was the best geological engineer in 3 territories. If he taught her, we proceed with the full rebuild. Jonathan cut him off. Get me cost estimates from Denver suppliers. But that night, alone in his office with lamp burning low, Jonathan's hand drifted toward the rolled diagrams Sarah had left after her first visit. In Fadim and Bean Cherubor. They sat exactly where she'd placed them, gathering dust. He didn't open them. Jonathan's father had died building this mine. Not from accident, but from the slow grind of years underground. Dust in his lungs, determination in his bones. Jonathan still remembered the lessons delivered in that rough voice. A man builds his empire with his own hands. Son. Trust only those who've proven themselves in dirt and darkness. His mother had died when Jonathan was 12, leaving his father to raise him alone in mining camps and frontier towns. Women, in his father's world, existed to be protected, kept safe from harsh realities. The mine was no place for delicate sensibilities. His father always said, men did the dangerous work so women could maintain civilization, teach children, tend homes, preserve the gentler aspects of humanity. Jonathan had never questioned it. In her own home across town, Sarah sat at Thomas's desk, lamplight falling across journals filled with his precise handwriting. She traced his notes on geological stress patterns, remembering how he'd defied every convention to teach her. Old rabbit bang. You've got the mind for it, Thomas had said, spreading surveys across their kitchen table 5 years into their marriage. And this territory needs every capable person it can get. Gender's got nothing to do with understanding how mountains think. Unai. He'd taught her to read stone-like language, to calculate load-bearing capacity, to see patterns in what looked like random rock. When illness took him 2 years ago, she'd lost her husband but kept his knowledge. His careful documentation of every shaft and seam in Reed's mine. She'd stayed in the territory when she could have left. Could have taken her skills to San Francisco, where some companies might hire a woman engineer, without seeing her gender first. But this was Thomas's home. His life's work mapped in these journals. Honoring him meant using what he'd taught her. A tremor rattled the house, gentle but unmistakable. Sarah's hand steadied the lamp automatically, her mind already calculating depth and distance. Eastern shaft, she thought. Same pattern as 3 nights ago. At the mine, the tremor shook Jonathan's office harder. Davis had just delivered the evening report. Materials from Denver wouldn't arrive for 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if weather delayed freight wagons. 3 weeks. Jonathan stood so fast his chair scraped. The shaft's deteriorating now. You said we needed to move fast. I know, sir. Davis looked exhausted. But there's no other option. Unless don't. Jonathan said, Sir. Mrs. Mitchell's plan. I said don't. Jonathan moved to the window, watched darkness settle over the mountain. In the distance, Sarah's house showed a single lamp burning. He imagined her there, reading Thomas's journals, possessing knowledge that might save his mind. His father's voice whispered, women are too delicate. But his own voice, quieter, countered. Or maybe I'm too rigid. The tremor subsided. Jonathan stared at the rolled diagrams on his side table. Still untouched. Still offering solutions he refused to see. His hand reached toward them, fingers extending across empty air, then pulled back. Get the Denver materials ordered, he told Davis. We'll make do until they arrive. That night. Another tremor came, stronger this time, lasting 5 full seconds. In houses throughout the mining town, families felt their floors shake and thought about what would happen if the mine collapsed, if the jobs disappeared, if the town that depended on Jonathan Reed's operation simply ceased to exist. Jonathan lay awake, staring at ceiling beams. The weight of responsibility pressed down like overburden. All that rock and earth above a mine shaft. All those lives depending on his decisions. He still didn't open Sarah's plans. Sunday morning dawned clear, rare winter sunlight making the snow-covered mountains gleam. Jonathan dressed carefully for church service, the ritual providing structure even as his mind faced crisis. 11 days since the cave-in. Materials still 2 weeks away. The eastern shaft sat idle. Half his operations capacity lost. The church filled with mining families. Their Sunday clothes worn but dignified. Jonathan took his usual place in the third pew, acknowledging nods from workers and their wives. Then Sarah entered with the other mining widows, and Jonathan felt the shift in atmosphere. She sat across the aisle, 3 rows back, composed, dignified. Her dark dress simple but well kept. She didn't look his way, just settled in and opened her hymnal with the other women who'd lost husbands to illness or accident over the years. But Jonathan felt eyes on him, felt the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Everyone in town knew Sarah had offered solutions, knew he'd refused twice, knew the mind sat vulnerable while pride prevented action. Pastor Williams took the pulpit. An older man with frontier wisdom in his weathered face. His sermon drew from Proverbs. Something about wisdom calling out in the streets. About fools despising instruction. Sometimes, the pastor said, his voice carrying gentle authority. The help we need comes from unexpected sources. Takes a humble man to receive it. Takes courage to set aside what we think we know in favor of what might save us. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the congregation. Jonathan kept his gaze forward, but awareness prickled his neck. Sarah remained motionless across the aisle, giving no indication she noticed the sermon's relevance. After service, as families gathered outside in the sunshine, Jonathan overheard fragments of conversation. Heard she's got Thomas's full geological surveys. My husband says the engineers don't know what to do. Pride's expensive when you're paying workers to stand idle. Da bisan no brinay, Briti. Exciker, he walked back to the mine office alone, taking the long route past the eastern shaft's entrance. The warning signs he'd posted closed pending repairs mocked him in the sunlight. Shirienda. That afternoon, a well-dressed man arrived on the Denver stage. Marcus Webb, representative from First Territorial Bank. Jonathan received him in his office with forced courtesy. Mr. Reed, Webb said, settling into a chair without invitation. The bank's concerned about your mine's current situation. We've extended considerable credit based on projected output. With Forex, Gotti, if you can't stabilize the eastern shaft soon. Materials are en route. Jonathan interrupted. In 2 weeks, Webb said. Maybe 3. Meanwhile, you're operating at half capacity. Payroll continues, and we're hearing about structural instability that might spread. The bank needs assurance you can resolve this, or we'll have to discuss calling in your loans. After Webb left, Jonathan sat alone as afternoon shadows lengthened. Through his window, he could see the mine entrance, the idle workers, the town that depended on steady wages. Beyond, mountains held their eternal watch, indifferent to human pride and human need. He noticed Sarah walking past on the street below, heading home from the general store with packages in her arms. She moved with quiet purpose, a woman accustomed to managing alone, to carrying both burden and solution without complaint. The ice on his office eaves dripped in the afternoon warmth. First genuine sign that winter might eventually yield to spring. But dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and Jonathan knew another storm approached. He looked again at the rolled diagrams gathering dust on his side table, still didn't reach for them. Outside, the mountain rumbled, just a whisper this time, barely noticeable, but Jonathan had learned to listen to whispers before they became shouts. Monday morning, Jonathan arrived at the mine to find his young foreman Ben waiting outside the office, hat turning nervously in his hands. Ben was maybe 25. Had worked under Thomas Mitchell for 3 years before the older man's death. Mr. Reed, Ben said quietly, "KT. Could I speak with you private inside?" Jonathan poured coffee for them both. Waiting. "Sir, I respect you." Ben began, choosing words carefully. "You've been fair to me, given me responsibility, but I knew Thomas Mitchell, worked alongside him, learned from him. He was the best engineer in 3 territories." Jonathan said nothing, just waited. "He taught Mrs. Mitchell everything." Ben's voice steadied with conviction. "I saw them working together. Saw how he'd explain the geology, how she'd do the calculations. She's got his knowledge, sir. All of it. Thomas used to say she understood these mountains better than most men who'd worked them 20 years. Yeah, Ben, the men are scared." Ben interrupted, then caught himself. "Sorry, sir, but it's true. They've got families, kids. If that shaft collapses during a shift, or if the mine shuts down because we can't fix it, doesn't matter who drew up the solution. What matters is whether it works. Jonathan studied the young man's face, saw the courage it took for a foreman to challenge his boss this way. You're risking your position telling me this. I'm risking more by staying silent. Ben said, we all are. After Ben left, Jonathan sat with those words. His father's voice seemed quieter now, further away. His own conscience spoke louder. Is pride really worth risking everything? That evening, Jonathan stopped at the general store for tobacco. Sarah was there, buying flour and coffee. The ordinary tasks of solitary living. They nearly collided at the counter. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, stepping back. Mr. Reed, she nodded politely. Paid for her goods. The storekeeper, old Peterson, who'd known them both for years, said conversationally. Mrs. Mitchell could have left the territory after Thomas passed. Had opportunities in San Francisco. I heard some engineering firm out there willing to hire on credentials regardless of, he caught himself. Well, she stayed. Said this was Thomas's home, his work. She honors him by staying, by using what he taught her. Sarah's expression didn't change. But Jonathan saw something flicker in her eyes. Not plea. Not anger. Just quiet dignity. Staying seemed right, she said simply. Gathering her packages, at the door, she paused, turned back to Jonathan. When you're ready. Mr. Reed, the offer stands. When you're ready. Not if, when. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Ben's courage, about Sarah's quiet persistence, about the responsibility he carried for an entire town's livelihood. At 3 a.m, he descended to his office, lit the lamp, and finally reached for Sarah's rolled diagrams. He spread them across his desk, waiting corners with books and ink bottles. Then he began to read. What he saw stunned him. The engineering was elegant, innovative, brilliant. She'd used Thomas's geological surveys to identify exactly where stress would concentrate, had designed a reinforcement pattern using local timber and available rock in ways that would distribute weight naturally. Her calculations accounted for future tremors, for seasonal water table changes, for expansion of adjacent shafts. It wasn't just competent, it was exceptional. Jonathan sat back, lamplight casting shadows across the precise diagrams. His engineers could execute this work. He realized they had the skills to implement her design, but none of them had seen the solution she'd seen. None had synthesized Thomas's knowledge with current conditions to create something this effective. Echt calm, Chot. His father's voice tried one more time. Women are too delicate. But Jonathan's own voice, stronger now, answered. Or maybe I've been blind. He looked at the diagrams again, seeing not a woman's work or a man's work, just brilliant engineering that could save his mine, save his town, save everything his father and Thomas Mitchell had built. It's my Hadishets. Dawn found him still at his desk, studying every detail, understanding with growing certainty that Sarah Mitchell might be the only person who could truly solve this crisis. The question wasn't whether her solution would work. The question was whether he had the courage to admit he'd been wrong. Day 13. The morning shift refused to enter the eastern shaft. Jonathan couldn't blame them. The creaking from the lower levels had grown ominous. Constant groaning like the mountain itself objecting to human intrusion. Davis reported stress fractures appearing in sections they'd thought stable just days before. We need to evacuate the entire eastern operation, Davis said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Fight. Today. Now." Jonathan gave the order. By noon, half his mind sat idle. Warning signs posted. Equipment abandoned in dark tunnels. The financial impact staggered him. Payroll continued, but production plummeted. Loans came due. The bank's threat hung over everything. Worse, Davis pulled him aside with maps showing new fracture patterns. "Sir, if the eastern shaft fails completely, the collapse could spread. These support walls here, they're shared with the northern operation. If they go, we might lose both shafts." Jonathan stared at the maps, seeing his entire operation potentially reduced to rubble, not just economic ruin. If men were underground when it happened. That evening, the church bell rang for emergency town meeting. Families filled the pews. Miners still in work clothes. Wives holding children. Everyone's faces showing worry barely held in check. Jonathan stood at the front, explaining the situation honestly. Full closure of the eastern shaft. Delayed materials. Economic strain. His voice remained steady, but he saw confidence wavering in familiar faces. What's the plan?" Someone called. How long we looking at reduced shifts?" 2 weeks minimum until materials arrive," Jonathan said. "Then reconstruction begins. Could be 3 months total before full operation resumes." Murmuring rippled through the congregation. 3 months. Families calculated silently savings. Debt. How long they could manage on reduced wages. Then Bill Henderson, an elder miner who'd worked for Jonathan's father, stood slowly. His weathered face showed no anger, just honest question. "What about Mrs. Mitchell's solution? Heard she's got Thomas's plans. Knows the geology of that shaft better than anyone living." Every eye turned to Jonathan. Sarah sat 3 rows back, her expression neutral, giving away nothing. Jonathan's throat felt tight. "I haven't reviewed her plans thoroughly." The silence that followed felt crushing. Not hostile, just disappointed. These were good people who'd trusted his leadership, who'd believed in his judgment. Now they saw him choosing pride over their livelihoods. Might be worth a look, boss," Henderson said gently. "Time's running short. Thomas Mitchell knew those mountains, if he taught her true." The meeting dispersed slowly. Families gathering in small groups outside. Voices low and worried. Jonathan walked home alone through fresh snow, each step feeling heavier than the last. He wasn't just risking his mine anymore. He was risking the entire town's economy, dozens of families, children's futures. His prejudice had stopped being personal failure and become community crisis. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like the overburden above a mine shaft, all that rock and earth. And responsibility. All those lives depending on decisions he made. That night, he sat in his dark office, lamplight falling across Sarah's diagrams that he'd studied until he'd memorized every detail. Toad, the solution was there, had been there all along. Brilliant, effective, achievable. He just had to surrender his pride to reach for it. In Kalyad, the mountain rumbled again, a warning becoming harder to ignore. 3 a.m. found Jonathan still awake. Sarah's diagrams spread across every surface of his office. He'd moved beyond studying them to understanding them, seeing the elegance of her engineering, the way she'd synthesized Thomas's geological knowledge with practical construction methods. She wasn't just competent. She might be the only person in the territory who could save his mine. The realization sat heavy in his chest. His father had been wrong. Not about the hardship of mining. Not about the dangers, those were real. But about women being too delicate for harsh realities. Sarah had lived through harsh reality losing Thomas. managing alone. Possessing knowledge the world told her she shouldn't have, and emerged stronger, clearer, more capable than Jonathan had given her credit for. Pride had made him blind. Around 4, he finally slept in his office chair, head pillowed on his arms, surrounded by diagrams that represented both solution and indictment. Nekada Salves. Dawn woke him, genuine dawn. Winter sunrise breaking clear and cold, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Jonathan moved to the window, watching light transform the landscape. His mind sat quiet in that morning glow. Hundreds of feet of tunnels, years of work, his father's legacy, and his own sweat, and the livelihoods of good people who deserved better than his stubborn prejudice. The choice clarified like that sunrise, sudden and complete. His father's memory, or the town's survival. His comfort, or his responsibility. No choice at all. Really. Jonathan saddled his horse in the stable, rode through empty streets toward Sarah's modest house on the town's edge. Vervointi stirre. Smoke rose from her chimney. She was awake. Probably had been for hours, managing her solitary life with the same competence she'd bring to engineering. He tied his horse outside, climbed the 3 steps to her door, removed his hat. She answered his knock, surprise flickering across her face before settling into cautious neutrality. "Mr. Reed, it's early. I've been up all night," he said, "studying your diagrams, reading every calculation, every reinforcement pattern, every detail of your solution." Sarah waited, giving him nothing. "You're right," Jonathan continued, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "About all of it. The engineering is brilliant. Thomas taught you well better than well. You understand those mountains, that mine, in ways I didn't think possible. But I'm a woman," Sarah said quietly. "So you dismissed it anyway?" "Yes." He met her eyes. "I was raised to believe women needed protection from harsh realities. My father taught me mining was men's work. That female delicacy made them unsuitable for this kind of challenge. I never questioned it until my prejudice nearly destroyed everything." The morning breeze stirred snow from the eaves, scattering it like diamonds in the early light. "Namis." "Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah, I was wrong, completely, stubbornly, dangerously wrong. Your competence could save my mine, save jobs, save this entire town. If the offer still stands, I'm asking not as someone doing you a favor, but as someone who desperately needs your help." Sarah studied him, measuring sincerity in the way she'd measure load-bearing capacity precisely, carefully, looking for weakness that would fail under pressure. "The offer stands." "Mr. Reed," she said finally, "but I work as head engineer, with full authority to direct the crew and make decisions about implementation. Not as a consultant you can override when it suits you, not as Thomas's widow bringing his knowledge, as the engineer in charge." Jonathan nodded. "Agreed." "And you credit me publicly?" She continued, "Why, when this works, if this works, you don't let people assume it was your engineer's solution. You acknowledge that a woman engineer saved your mine." "I will," he promised. She extended her hand, not delicate, but strong from years of drafting and calculating, from honoring Thomas's legacy through competence rather than grief. "You found it, big stone all it." Jonathan shook it, feeling the calluses on her palm, the firm grip of someone accustomed to holding steady under pressure. "We start today." Sarah said, "I'll need to inspect the shaft myself. Verify current conditions match my calculations. Then we begin implementation immediately." "Whatever you need," Jonathan said, As he rode back toward the mine, the sun climbed higher, burning off morning frost, illuminating a path forward that had been there all along. He just hadn't been willing to see it. Until necessity forced his eyes open, Sarah arrived at the mine before 8. Carrying Thomas's journals and her own updated calculations, the crew gathered at the eastern shaft entrance, their faces showing uncertainty that shifted when Jonathan stepped forward. "Men," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled workers. "This is Sarah Mitchell, your new head engineer. She'll be directing all stabilization work on the eastern shaft. You follow her instructions, exactly as you'd follow mine." "Understood." The crew exchanged glances. Then Ben stepped forward, removed his hat. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Mitchell. Aye." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, then moved to business with quiet authority. We have 5 days to implement the reinforcement pattern. I need teams of 4, rotating shifts to maintain continuous progress. Ben, I want your best timbermen identifying and preparing local materials according to these specifications. Shaped by our soul. She spread diagrams on a makeshift table, explaining the engineering with clarity that left no room for confusion. The men listened, asked questions, received answers that demonstrated depth of knowledge impossible to dismiss. By noon, work had begun in earnest. Sarah moved through the shaft with lanterns, checking measurements, directing placement, solving problems as they emerge. Jonathan watched from a distance, seeing his workers respond to her leadership, seeing her solve in hours what his engineers had struggled with for days. She was methodical, brilliant, patient with the crew while maintaining exacting standards. When a support beam proved slightly warped, she recalculated weight distribution on the spot, adjusted the pattern to compensate. When a worker questioned a technique, she explained the engineering principle behind it until understanding replaced doubt. 5 days of intense labor followed. The town watched progress with cautious hope, families gathering each evening to hear reports from their men. The eastern shaft's ominous creaking quieted as Sarah's reinforcement pattern took hold, distributing stress across natural load-bearing points exactly as her calculations predicted. On the 5th day, Davis conducted structural tests and came to Jonathan with wonder in his eyes. "It's working." "Sir, better than working. It's better than the original construction. She's made that shaft more stable than it's been in a decade." And Saturday evening, the crew completed final inspections. Sarah stood in the lower level, examining every support, every connection, every detail of the implementation. Satisfied. She emerged into twilight. Dust on her clothes, exhaustion on her face, triumph in her eyes. The eastern shaft is certified safe. She told Jonathan, "You can resume full operations Monday morning." Relief flooded the town that night. Men bought drinks at the saloon, wives embraced in the general store. Children felt the tension ease in their homes without understanding exactly why. Sunday morning, the church filled beyond capacity. Pastor Williams offered a prayer of thanksgiving, then yielded the pulpit to Jonathan with a knowing look. Jonathan stood before the congregation, every family in town, every person whose livelihood depended on his mind, every face that had watched this crisis unfold. "I need to tell you all something," he began, his voice steady but humble. "The mine is safe because of Sarah Mitchell's engineering. Not despite her being a woman, but because she's a skilled engineer who learned from the best and applied that knowledge with brilliance via a mishpi. I couldn't match." He paused, seeing Sarah sitting with the mining widows, her expression carefully neutral. My prejudice nearly destroyed everything we've built here. I was raised to believe women were too delicate for harsh realities, that mining was men's work. I let that belief blind me to competence, to wisdom, to the very solution that could save us. Sarah offered her help 3 times. I refused twice. And the 3rd time came almost too late. The congregation sat silent, absorbed in his confession. Her engineering didn't just save the eastern shaft. It saved jobs, saved families, saved this town's future. Everything we have, everything we've preserved. We owe to her competence and her grace in offering help, even after I'd insulted. Her capability? He turned to face Sarah directly. I was wrong. Mrs. Mitchell, completely, dangerously wrong. This community owes you more than thanks. We owe you the respect and recognition you've earned through skill, knowledge, and character. Sarah stood slowly, acknowledging the congregation's applause with quiet dignity. No triumph, no vindication, just a woman who'd done good work and been finally recognized for it. After the service, Jonathan found her outside in the spring-like sunshine early March, showing genuine warmth for the first time. I owe you more than public thanks, he said quietly. I owe you the truth. I was raised to see women as needing protection from harsh realities. What I'm learning is that prejudice, not mining, is the harsh reality, and you don't need my protection. You need my respect. Sarah regarded him thoughtfully. Recognizing you were wrong takes more courage than defending false certainty, Mr. Reed. That's the first real wisdom you've shown. Not forgiveness yet. Jonathan thought, but acknowledgement. A beginning. Spring came early that year, as if the mountains themselves approved of change. By early April, snowmelt filled the creeks, wildflowers dotted the meadows, and Sarah Mitchell's presence at the mine had shifted from novelty to established fact. She worked from an office adjacent to Jonathan's, her desk covered with surveys and calculations for expanding the northern shaft. The crew consulted her on everything from timber selection to drainage patterns. She'd become indispensable, not because she was Thomas's widow, but because she was the best engineer in the territory. Jonathan found himself seeking her company beyond work hours. They took walks along the creek in the evenings, discussed engineering and philosophy, shared memories of Thomas without the conversation feeling morbid. She had a quiet sense of humor, strong opinions on everything from mine safety to territorial politics, and a way of challenging his thinking that made him question assumptions he'd held for years. You're learning, she said one evening, watching sunset paint the mountains copper and gold. That's more than most men would do. I had a good teacher, he replied. Several. Actually, you, Ben. Even the crew who were patient with my ignorance. Sarah smiled. Pride's not the same as ignorance. You were proud. Now you're learning humility, which is harder but more valuable. Throughout April, Jonathan courted her properly, not as rescued man to rescuer, but as someone who genuinely valued her mind, her competence, her character. He brought her books from Denver, asked her opinion on mine expansion, listened when she explained geological theories he'd never considered. In Exemfersen, down. She accepted his attention with cautious warmth, clearly measuring whether this change in him was genuine or temporary. One evening in late April, they rode to a mountain meadow where wildflowers had erupted in purple and gold, where snow still capped distant peaks, but valleys showed vibrant life. Jonathan helped her dismount, and they walked through flowers that brushed their knees. Sarah, he said, stopping beneath an aspen tree beginning to leaf out. I'm asking you to marry me, not because you saved my mind, though you did, not because I owe you, though I do, but because you've taught me what I refuse to see. That strength and wisdom don't follow the patterns I was raised to expect. You've made me a better man, challenged me to be more than my father's son. I'd be honored if you'd share your life with mine. Sarah studied him with those clear, assessing eyes. I'll marry you, Jonathan Reed, but it comes with conditions. Name them. You hire based on skill, not gender. You judge on competence, not prejudice. You let me continue as head engineer without trying to shield me from harsh realities when decisions get difficult. And if we have daughters, you teach them they can build anything they set their minds to. No limitations based on what society says women should or shouldn't do. Jonathan nodded without hesitation. Agreed, all of it. And one more thing, Sarah added, a smile playing at her lips. No more unopened plans gathering dust on side tables. When someone offers you wisdom, you at least look at it before dismissing them. He laughed, pulled her close, kissed her beneath the budding aspen. Agreed. I've learned that lesson thoroughly. Their wedding in May became the talk of mining territories throughout Colorado. Word spread about the woman engineer who'd saved Reed Mine, about the baron who'd publicly confessed his prejudice and hired her as head engineer. And now and six. Some operators scoffed, called it foolishness. Others, seeing the mine's increased efficiency under Sarah's innovations, began quietly reconsidering their own hiring practices. Change came slowly. Frontier society didn't transform overnight, but seeds were planted in conversations around saloons and Sunday dinners, in young girls hearing about Sarah Mitchell, who designed mine shafts and married on her own terms, in young men learning that competence mattered more than gender. The following winter, Jonathan and Sarah stood in their shared office, 2 desks, both covered with engineering plans, lamplight warm between them. Outside, December snow fell gently, but inside felt bright, with purpose and partnership. Sarah reviewed calculations for the northern expansion while Jonathan studied her innovations for water. Drainage. The mine operated at record efficiency, employing more workers than ever. With safety standards that had become model for the region, the shift whistle blew end of day. They looked up from their work as miners emerged from the mountain, heading home to families, to warm suppers, to lives made possible by silver pulled from stone and engineering that kept them safe. Jonathan crossed to Sarah's desk, looked over her shoulder at her latest designs. This pattern here, you're compensating for seasonal water table changes. Thomas's surveys showed fluctuation between spring melt and winter freeze. She explained. If we account for it in the initial design, we avoid structural stress later. He kissed the top of her head. Brilliant, like everything you do. She smiled, caught his hand. Like everything we do together now, outside. Spring flowers waited beneath snow, ready to bloom when warmth returned. Inside, 2 people worked side by side. Their stubbornness now pointed the same direction. Their partnership built on respect, earned through crisis and wisdom, gained through humility. Her innovations, his resources, both their determination now joined in common purpose. And the whole territory better for it.